Good morning, class. Today we'll be doing a new chapter, that is Globalization and Social Change in India. And in this particular chapter, we'll be studying the trends of globalization and how did globalization created an impact in the Indian society, both the negative consequences and the positive consequences of globalization. Now, before we get into the details, we'll just start with a small introduction regarding globalization. And as we all know, what is globalization? Globalization is, it basically involves movement of goods and people and services, and it's basically getting connected with people who are spread across the world. And getting connected is possible only when there is information technology. So globalization without information technology is something which is not possible. Now, the effect of globalization is far-reaching. It affects us all, but affects us differently. That is, when globalization started in India in the year around 1990s, there were a lot of changes that had taken place. Some of the changes had actually improved the lives of people, while there were some changes which had affected really badly, especially the occupations that were carried by people who were involved into small trade and business. Those kind of occupations got affected very badly. So we'll just quickly do some few examples on what were the effects of globalization. For example, when globalization had come, the women silk spinners and twisters of Bihar lost their jobs once the Chinese and Korean silk entered the Indian market. The reason being the Chinese and Korean silk had a shine and a luster, and it was cheap compared to the Indian silk that was sold in the market. As a result, most of the people were attracted towards this kind of particular shine that was being given by the Chinese and Korean silk. Apart from that, the similar displacement had occurred with the entry of large fishing vessels into Indian waters. And these vessels, they took away the fish that used to be earlier collected by Indian fishermen, and the livelihood of women fish sorters, dryers, vendors and net makers thereby got affected. Likewise, in Gujarat, the gum collectors, they also lost their job, since gum was now imported from Sudan at a much cheaper rate. Apart from that, the rat pickers, they also lost some of their employment, because now the waste paper were basically imported from developed countries. But these are some of the negative consequences of globalization, but there have been a lot of positive consequences as well. For example, there have been an economic boom in our country, and secondly, a lot of new occupations have come up, boom in the IT industry, information technology industry, as a result, which had led to creation of a lot of jobs. Like nowadays, we have the call centers and BPOs, and the young students who do not want to go to the conventional streams like BA, BSc and BCom, they basically opt for call centers and BPOs to make new money, quick money. And and globalization also basically helped in preserving the traditional art forms, like some of the things that were used by people earlier, like haldi, speaking about rudrash, etc., basmati rice, which are still being used today. Which has been made accessible to people nowadays, because some of the MNCs have taken the task of preserving these traditional elements and selling it, right? So these were some of the impact of globalization. Now moving on to a very important question, that is whether global interconnections are new to the world and to India. That is it that only in the year 1990s did India experience globalization? Was India never in touch or never into trade and commerce with foreign countries? But that question is something which has been refuted, and a lot of evidences which is being given here actually prove that India was always in touch, was always involved into intensive trade and commerce with the foreign countries. It's not that the Britishers had come and started and have established capitalism and globalization. It was always there. Maybe it was not that prominent. So the early years, it is said that India was never isolated from the world, even 2000 years ago. And an example that is given here is about the Silk Route, which centuries ago connected India to the great civilizations that existed in China, Persia, Egypt, and Rome. And there have been a lot of evidences that at different points of time, at different periods of time, traders and conquerors had come to a country and they had established their settlements. They had been engaged into intensive trade and commerce with the outside countries. So we can't say that India was completely isolated. It was never in contact with the outside world. Now, moving on from early years, when the colonial rulers had come to a country and they had basically established capitalism, through which the global connection was again intensified, and often globalization today identifies a large-scale movement of people, which is referred as migration, a very defining feature. And there have been instances, a lot of instances where during colonialism period, there have been a lot of movements of people, like a lot of people were shipped off to distant countries as slaves. A lot of people were brought into India also. So movement of people and goods have been there during the period of colonialism as well, which had given a very distinct character to globalization. And after the Britishers had left and our country achieved independence, globalization took a very prominent form, and India basically retained a global outlook. So commitment to liberation struggles throughout the world, solidarity with people from different parts of the world was very much part of this vision. And today, if we look at our country, we see that globalization has well established, has done its job very well. And it's not only globalization has also brought along with it liberalization and marketization as well. Now we move on to the different dimensions of globalization, and basically there are 5 dimensions of globalization which actually explain this particular social phenomena called globalization. And the number 1 is the economic policy of liberalization. Now liberalization policy started in India in 1990s, and it basically refers to deregulation and that is lessening the control of lessening government control from the Indian markets. During the period of liberalization, disinvestment also took place. As a result, the public sector companies were sold off and the shares were sold off to the private sectors, and there was a privatization that was taking place. Now earlier, what was the situation? Earlier it was just that the Indian government, it never wanted our country to get connected with the outside world, because it always had a fear that Indian market cannot compete with the foreign markets, and in order to basically protect the Indian markets from the foreign countries, from the competition of the wider world, it had taken a very conservative attitude for a very long time. But after liberalization started, it changed the entire dimension, and Indian economy was exposed to the world market, and a lot of changes were incorporated. For example, that liberalization took place, and that actually meant steady removal of the rules and that regulated Indian trade and finance regulations. And there were a lot of reforms that had taken place in some of the sectors like agriculture, industry, trade, foreign investment, and technology, etc. And that actually proved to be highly beneficial to our economy, right? So moving on to another important part is that the process of globalization, it also involves taking loans from international institutions like IMF, International Monetary Fund, and these loans are given on certain conditions. That is, the government make commitments to pursue certain kind of economic measures that involve a policy of structural adjustment. So these adjustments usually mean cutting in state expenditure in the social sectors such as health, education, and social security. Now moving on to the second dimension of globalization, which is the transnational corporations. Now TNCs, or transnational corporation, their role is equivalent. It plays a very important role, and it's regarded as one of the economic factors that have driven globalization. And TNCs are basically companies that produce goods or market services in more than one country, and they are relatively small firms, or they can also be gigantic corporations. Some of the best known examples of TNCs include Coca-Cola, General Motors, Kodak, Colgate, Palmolive, Mitsubishi, and many others. And they are oriented to the global markets and global profits, even if they have a clear national base. So this is also one of the economic factors under globalization. The third one is electronic economy. Now this particular dimension is something with which we are all familiar with. The entire stock market is basically dependent on the electronic economy. Things have become so easy that by sitting at home, you can actually, with a click of a mouse, you can transfer millions of funds to some other company with whom you're doing business. So life has become very easy with just a click of mouse, and this has been possible because there have been communication technology without which the electronic economy would not have never survived. And in India, often this is discussed with reference to rising stock markets and also sudden dips because of foreign investors buying stocks, making a profit, and then selling them off. Now, the next feature, the fourth one, is a very interesting one, and that is referred to as the weightless economy or knowledge economy. Now, what is weightless economy? It's just that a weightless economy is economy that does not involve in physical production of goods, that nobody is stocking, making products and stocking in the harbors or piling up stocks. Everything is stored in the computer or the system. And it is basically, we define weightless economy as the one in which products have their base in information, as in the case with computer software, media and entertainment products, and internet-based services. So a knowledge economy is one in which much of the workforce is involved not in the physical production of goods, but in their design, implementation, development, technology, marketing, sale, and servicing. So whatever, I'll give you a very good example of the online shopping. Most of us indulge into it, and whenever you're buying something online, we do look for the product specification, and you have a lot of information that is being given about that particular product, right? So relying on those information that is being stored in their site, we go on buying and selling a particular product, and that's a classic example of weightless economy. Another example can be like, many of us, we are not involved in physical production of goods, right? Some of us, people do make money by selling their advice, people do make money through counseling, people do make money through teaching. So these are some of the things that come under the weightless economy, and we often call these kinds of economy as thin air business. That is, we produce nothing that can be weighed, touched, or easily measured. Our output is not stockpiled at harbors, stored in warehouses, or shipped in railway cars. And lastly, another important dimension of globalization is globalization of finance. And this is basically that due to information technology revolution, there has been a globalization of finance, and globally integrated financial markets undertake billions of dollars worth transactions within seconds in the electronic circuits. London, Tokyo, and New York are the key centers for financial trading, and in India, Mumbai is basically known as the financial capital of the country. Now, moving on to global communication, there is something called digital divide. That is, some places have access to information technology, like some offices have fax machines, they go for video conferencing, they have telephones, they have internet connection, etc. But there are some houses which lack these kind of technological innovations, and that is called as digital divide, the gap that is created between some areas which have access to it and some areas that does not. And basically we are speaking about the interior parts, the rural areas where most people do not have access to proper communication technology, and that have actually widened the gap in some cases. Now we move on to the globalization and new international division of labor, where we'll be dealing with the difference between post-Fordism and Fordism. And what is Fordism? Fordism basically was started by Henry Ford, who initiated the process called assembly line production in order to increase the goods produced at a given point of time. And his method of the assembly line production became so famous that it was later on incorporated by most of the factories and industries who were involved into mass production. So Fordism basically includes mass production, and there's a lot of security to the workers who are working there. They're given proper wages. Now, what is post-Fordism? It is something that relates to flexible production of goods, and it is not stationed at just one place. It keeps on moving, it keeps on changing. It's just like setting up the production center in one place, and if the situation is not conducive after some time, then they pull up the production process and they take it to some other place where the situation is conducive. And that depends on a lot of things like the labor cost, the working environment, etc. So this is something which is flexible. But the problem is that the workers working in these kind of post-Fordism, production under post-Fordism, they do not have security, and often their wages are not that high. And one of the classic examples was Nike. Nike was basically founded by Phil Knight, who imported shoes from Japan and sold them at athletic meetings. And his entire production system was basically based on the concept of post-Fordism, how he started changing. Like he basically in 1960s he started with Ford, and when the cost increased, he shifted his production to South Korea, and when the labor cost again grew in South Korea, he shifted his production to Thailand and Indonesia, right? So, and the entire process basically makes the laboring population very vulnerable and insecure. And this flexibility of labor often works in favors of the producers. So this is just a difference between Fordism and post-Fordism. And now moving on to a very important part, that is globalization and political changes. How globalization have also led to a lot of political changes, like the collapse of the erstwhile social world that hastened globalization. It led to the introduction of neoliberal economic measures that focused on the concept of free market. There was emergence of IGOs and INGOs, that is the International Governmental Organization and the International Non-Governmental Organization that basically works. Due to globalization, there have been a growth of international and regional mechanisms for political collaboration. For example, the European Union, the Association of South Asian Regional Conference, etc. These are some of the international regional mechanisms that had emerged after globalization. Now we move on to globalization and culture, very important. Another very interesting part, how globalization had affected the culture of a country, and it had basically changed the concept. Like Indian society was basically like a kupa manduka, living inside of, that is a frog living inside a well, not bothered about what is happening outside, and even not interested. But after globalization, things have changed, our perceptions have changed. We have retained a much more global outlook. We perceive things in a different way. There have been a lot of changes in the lifestyle of the people, the food habits, the dressing sense of the people have changed a lot. There have been merging of local and global culture, that is referred to as globalization. And it is often criticized that globalization, is it mere synthesis of culture, or is it completely aimed at making profit? But that is actually not so. So culture has definitely undergone a lot of changes under globalization, and it has led to two kinds of culture, that is culture of consumption. Now the current trend is basically, current trend that is going on is basically consuming more and more, and to be careful with money is no longer a virtue. Shopping is a pastime that is actively encouraged. And the reason behind this is that most of the people are working as high-flying professionals, and they are earning a lot, and they are spending a lot. Apart from that, there is something called corporate culture. What is corporate culture? Corporate culture is basically a branch of management theory that seeks to increase productivity and competitiveness through the creation of a unique organizational culture involving all members of a firm. So every corporate sector has its own corporate culture, and it's thought to enhance employee loyalty and promote group solidarity. So this is the different changes that have taken place under globalization. And finally, is globalization has also threatened many indigenous craft and literary traditions and knowledge systems. Like theatre groups, if you look at it, it has now become dysfunctional, it is extinct now. Whereas some of the traditional knowledge forms, especially in the fields of medicines and agriculture, have been preserved and passed on from generation to generation. So this was all about globalization, speaking about the effects of globalization, how it has changed the how it has basically changed the life of people, the different dimensions that have been established in society under globalization, how it has also led to the economic growth and development of our country. And related to globalization, we'll just put on like how globalization had also led to a lot of changes in the rural society. We'll be speaking about the Green Revolution and its consequences of rural society. So the next chapter that we'll be starting is the rural society and how it has changed. What are the changes that we are thinking about have taken place in rural society. Basically, if we look at the rural society, the village areas, most of the people are involved into agricultural activities, into farming. But now the situation has changed, because you will often find people who are also indulged or engaged in non-agricultural activity. So village area, the composition of people, we will be focusing on the class and caste structure of the village area and the Green Revolution, etc., and its consequences. So if we look at the term agrarian structure, it is often used to refer to the structure or distribution of land holding. Because agricultural land is the most important productive resource in rural areas, access to land shapes the rural class structure. So, if we look at the class structure of the rural areas, it is divided into three divisions. We have the medium and large landowners, who are usually able to earn sufficient or even large incomes from cultivation. The next layer basically have the agricultural laborers, who are more often than not paid below the statutory minimum wage and earn very little. And the last division, that includes the tenants. They are the cultivators who lease their land from landowners, have lower income than owners and cultivators. So this is basically the class structure of the rural areas. And basically the SCs and STs, they are not allowed to own land, and they provide most of the agricultural labor for the dominant large landowning groups. So this also created a labor force that allowed the landowners to cultivate the land intensively and get higher returns. Now, there is a rough correspondence between caste and class, means that typically the upper and middle caste also had the best access to land resources and hence power and privilege. And this had important implications for the rural economy as well and society. For example, in most of the regions of the country, a proprietary caste group owns most of the resources and command labor to work for them. And until recently, practices such as begar or free labor were prevalent in many parts of the northern India. Members of low-ranked caste groups had to provide labor for a fixed number of days per year to the village zamindars or landlords. Similarly, lack of resources and dependence on the landed class for economic, social and political power meant that many of the working poor were tied to landowners in hereditary relationship. That is the Halpati system in Gujarat and Jita system in Karnataka. So this is some of the features of the land structure. Now we'll be moving on to the land reform movement in the colonial period and in the independent India. In the colonial period, we know that the zamindars, they played a very important role. They were basically the middlemen between the Britishers and the poor tenants, the cultivators, right? And these zamindars, they used to exploit the poor people, the agricultural laborers, by taking excess rent from them, which mostly they paid to the Britishers, and rest of the money they had kept to themselves. And that was something which was a very exploitative system. And after the independent movement, there was a lot of laws, land reform laws that were introduced. Amongst these laws was a law that basically aimed at abolition of the zamindari system, and that actually eventually got abolished. The second law that focused on was basically Tenancy Abolition and Regulation Acts, that in order to improve the conditions of the tenants, because tenants were basically the worst of people. They paid the rent of the land which they used to take on lease from the landlords. On top of that, they also had to give more than half of the produce to the landlords. At the end of the day, they were left with nothing. So laws were made in order to secure their conditions. And the third law, that was one of the most important law in the land reform movement after independence, was the Land Ceding Acts. And these laws basically imposed an upper limit on the amount of land that can be owned by a particular family. So if the land was very productive, then that particular family was not allowed to own more land. If the land was unproductive, then of course that particular family was allowed to own. Now, what actually it aimed at? It wanted to take away the excess land from the landlords and redistribute it amongst the poor laborers, agricultural laborers, and peasants. Now, most of the rich landlords, they played a very cruel game, a very shrewd game, that they started resorting to means like Benami transfer. That is, they started transferring the lands in the name of the nameless people, so the lands can be kept at their own homes. So it had many loopholes, and eventually it did not work out. Now, speaking about Green Revolution, it was a governmental program of agricultural modernization, and it basically wanted to promote HYV seed, that is high yielding variety seeds that could yield more and more produce. Right? Now the problem was that the Green Revolution led to a lot of regional disparities. That is, there were some regions which were already productive, and there were certain regions which were not productive. Now, the rich landlords and the farmers, the rich landlords basically could afford the cost of these seeds. They definitely buy these seeds and they started yielding more. While the poor farmers, who could not afford it, they were taking loans in order to buy these seeds, and eventually that led to a lot of disastrous consequences. And apart from it was that Green Revolution, it also increased inequalities in rural society. That is, the rich became richer, the poor became poorer. And apart from increasing inequalities in rural societies, it also led to regional disparities. As I said, that some of the regions like Punjab, Haryana, which were already very productive, a lot of improvements and development was taking place in those regions, while some of the regions, states like Bihar and other state, Eastern UP, Telangana, etc., they remained undeveloped, right? And another negative consequence of Green Revolution was that the farmers were dependent on those particular seeds, and they were one-time use. That is, after using once, you cannot reuse them. So they automatically had to buy them, and that costed very high. So that increased the dependence on the MNCs who was offering these kinds of seeds, and as a result, it led to a lot of problems as well. Now, what were the transformation in rural society that took after independence? Like an increase in the use of agricultural laborers, cultivation became more intensive, a shift from payment in kind to cash, loosening of traditional bonds or hereditary relationships between farmers or landowners and agricultural workers, and the rise of a class of free wage laborers. So these were the changes that had taken place in rural society after independence. And there was a lot of changes in the class structure also. For example, in several agricultural rich regions such as coastal Andhra Pradesh, western Uttar Pradesh, central Gujarat, well-to-do farmers belonging to dominant caste began to invest their profits from agriculture and other types of business ventures. And this process of diversification gave rise to new entrepreneurial groups, and these were the people who were rich farmers who were working in villages, who had lands, but they were also involved not only into agriculture but into a lot of other business activities, and they were basically referred to as rural elites. So this was again a change in the class structure of the rural areas. And a very important concept that I would like to discuss is circulation of labor. That was another significant change in rural society that linked to the commercialization of agriculture and had been the growth of migrant agricultural laborers. So basically, under this particular concept, the laborers who were working in the fields of the landlords, when the harvest season was not there, they used to move to other cities and they worked as construction laborers. And when again the harvest season started, they came back and they again started working in the fields of the landlords. And as a result, they were not secured, very much secured with their jobs, and that also gave a very unique character to the labor force who were working in the agricultural laborers. So migration and lack of job security create very poor working conditions, living working condition for these laborers. And finally, we'll be moving on to the contract farming. That was another important thing that had started under globalization. And contract farming was basically it was a contract between the farmers and the MNCs. That is, the farmers, they got tied with the MNCs and they had to produce what the MNCs wanted them to do it. And it appeared that the contract farming was actually providing security to the farmers, but that eventually led to a lot of insecurity as the farmers became only dependent on these MNCs, and as a result of that, it often led to a lot of insecurities, and it also led to the exploitation of environment. So finally, we'll just wrap up with one of the most